There are moments that arrive without ceremony. No announcement. No signal. They move into the background of ordinary days and settle there so quietly that you don't recognize them as anything until much later, until you realize the ordinary you once knew has been quietly replaced. I spent most of my life believing transformation was visible. That change arrived through difficult conversations, through painful endings, through moments dramatic enough to point at a name. I thought there was always a before and an after you could locate precisely. I was wrong about that. Some changes don't begin with an event. They begin with a presence. Not one that demands recognition. One that simply rearranges the interior of your thoughts so gradually that by the time you notice, nothing is where it once was. I didn't see it happening. There was no reason I would have. My days continued as they always had. The same routine. The same habits. The same version of myself moving through the same familiar hours. Nothing visible had shifted. But the visible has never been where the real story lives. The real story lives underneath. Beneath language. Beneath emotion. Beneath the explanations we manufacture because silence makes us uneasy. That's where I found the change, not arriving all at once, not enough for anyone outside me to observe, just enough that returning to who I believed I had been was no longer possible. People tend to think understanding begins with answers. I've come to believe it begins with better questions. Not questions about who someone is or where they're going. Questions about why certain people feel familiar before they've been given any reason to. Questions about why some conversations feel unfinished after hours, while others feel complete after only a few words. Questions about why a single person's existence can quietly become part of the structure through which you interpret everything else, without ever asking permission. These aren't romantic questions. They exist at a deeper level than romance does. Romance depends on expectation. This doesn't. It survives without promises, without certainty, without a name. That's precisely what makes it resist explanation. I tried calling it coincidence. That didn't hold. I tried calling it curiosity. Curiosity fades. This didn't. I told myself familiarity was simply an illusion built from repetition. But repetition alone doesn't produce recognition. I've repeated conversations with countless people. Most dissolved from memory before the week ended. A handful stayed because circumstances required it. Very few stayed because something in the way they existed quietly attached itself to the way I understood the world. Those people become landmarks. Not because they're louder than everyone else. Because they become reference points. Everything begins making sense in relation to them. I never intended for anyone to become one of mine. I've always preferred distance. Watching. Listening. Observing before participating. Distance creates perspective. Perspective creates accuracy. Accuracy creates safety, or at least that's what I told myself. If you remain far enough from things, nothing reaches deeply enough to leave lasting marks. You become difficult to misread because very little is ever exposed. People encounter a carefully measured version of you. Not false. Filtered. A translation. The original stays somewhere else, untouched and protected. For years I believed that was wisdom. Now I wonder whether it was simply fear dressed neatly enough to pass as discipline. It's remarkable how long we can mistake our defenses for our character. Eventually they become inseparable. You begin presenting yourself through the walls you've constructed. You forget what existed before them. I didn't realize that it happened to me until something unexpected occurred. Nothing anyone else would have noticed. No confession. No turning point. No significant moment deserving a name. Something smaller. A pause. A silence that somehow felt more complete than most conversations I had ever been part of. Most silence feels like absence. People rush to escape it. They reach for the next sentence before the previous one has finished settling, because they believe that quiet means disconnection. I've never believed that. Some silences carry more truth than explanations ever could. Some pauses contain enough honesty to replace entire conversations. That was the first thing I noticed. Not what was said. What wasn't. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel responsible for carrying things forward. I didn't feel the quiet pressure to translate my thoughts into something smaller, something safer, something easier to receive. I didn't feel the familiar need to simplify what was genuinely complex so it would fit inside ordinary language. I simply allowed the moment to exist. That sounds like a small thing. It wasn't. People rarely notice how exhausting constant translation becomes. Imagine spending your entire life converting what you actually think into condensed, palatable versions because you assume no one wants the complete form. Imagine editing every sentence before it leaves your mouth, predicting misunderstandings before they occur and quietly adjusting yourself to prevent them. Eventually, you stop noticing you're doing it. It becomes automatic. You no longer speak. You navigate. When that disappears, even briefly, the contrast is immediate, almost unsettling. Not because freedom feels unfamiliar, because you had forgotten how heavy the restraint had become. That's what happened. Nothing more. And yet everything that followed felt slightly recalibrated, not transformed, the way an instrument tunes so gradually that the difference only becomes clear when the music begins to sound truer than it did before. Clarity is a strange thing. People assume they want it until it arrives. Then they discover that clarity removes excuses. Confusion permits delay. Uncertainty permits avoidance. Clarity quietly asks for honesty. Honesty asks for courage. I wasn't certain I had that courage. Not because the truth frightened me, because acknowledging it felt irreversible. There are realizations you cannot unknow once they've become visible. They're like doors that disappear the moment you walk through them. No sound. No announcement. Just the quiet understanding that the landscape behind you no longer exists. I began noticing myself differently. Not becoming someone else. Becoming more visible to myself. Those are separate experiences. Changing suggests replacement. Visibility suggests discovery. Perhaps we have always been ourselves. Perhaps life simply determines how much of that self becomes illuminated. If that's true, then certain people don't transform us. They reveal rooms inside us we've never entered. Rooms that existed long before anyone arrived. Locked. Waiting. Quietly patient beneath years of routine and careful distance. The strange part is that those rooms don't always contain answers. Sometimes they contain questions we've spent a lifetime carefully avoiding. Questions that don't accuse. Questions that simply remain present until we are finally willing to face them honestly. I've known intelligent people. I've known kind people. I've known people who understood my words. Very few seemed interested in the silence surrounding those words. There's always context beneath what's expressed. Always another layer beneath the obvious one. Most conversations end where language stops. The meaningful ones begin there. That space, the one that opens between two minds when neither feels obligated to perform, is rare. Not because honesty is rare, because sustained attention is. Most people listen long enough to prepare their response. Few remain present long enough for another person's thoughts to finish unfolding on their own. Genuine presence cannot be imitated. Once you've experienced it, every performance becomes transparent. Not disappointing. Simply visible for what it is. Perhaps that's why certain encounters refuse to disappear. Not because they overwhelmed us. Because they quietly became part of the lens through which we see everything that follows. I don't know where this leads. For the first time, I'm not trying to determine the destination. I'm paying attention to the direction instead. Maybe that's enough. Maybe certainty was never the point. Maybe understanding isn't something we arrive at. Maybe it's something we keep becoming, one quiet realization at a time, until the person looking back from our own reflection feels slightly less like a stranger than they did the day before.